On my last live stream, I attempted to read 100 stories live, but failed at around number 69. Here are the other scary stories. Enjoy. Frank from Sweden. When I was a kid, around 4 or 6, my mother had this boyfriend. Let's call him Frank. For the most part, he was an okay guy, but he had some serious mental issues, which we found out later. At some point, they decided to move to Albuquerque. We were in California then, and off we went. Things were okay for a bit, but Frank drank more and more, and was growing more and more paranoid each day. Eventually, my mother found that he had bought plane tickets for himself and a child, me, out of the country. She freaked out, and they got in a bit of a tiff that ended up with the cops arresting him because of attempted kidnapping. She was told he'd be in holding for about 4 days, long enough to pack up and leave. But that night, the cops decided to let him out. Why? Because he knew how to vomit blood, and they freaked out. The cops weren't the brightest. And instead of taking him to the hospital, they dropped him off at a Walgreens to get his medication, since clearly this guy was no threat. To make things worse, they didn't even bother calling her to warn her that, oh hey, the crazy guy who was planning on kidnapping your child is out roaming the streets. A few hours later, I'm asleep in a sleeping bag next to her when I wake up to find his shadowy figure standing over me. He had broke in. I scream. She jumps up and she literally throws him from the room, slams the door, and screams for me to lock it. I do, I think anyway. Never really came up. They start screaming at each other. The neighbors have already called the cops at this point because there was some creep sneaking around this place. At some point during their fight, she threw him through the sliding glass door. About the same time, 2 officers were sneaking around the house to see what the heck was going on. She was arrested, and he kept trying to tell them to let me stay with him. I was still locked in the bedroom. Eventually, the cops acquiesce, and she is, while still handcuffed, allowed to convince me to unlock the door. While he's screaming that I would be fine, they find all of the evidence of him planning on killing her and taking me to Sweden, where he was born and had dual nationality, so he could somehow keep me away from my grandparents and my father. I spent a few days in a CPS house while they sorted her information out. It was a weekend, which added time, and as soon as she was out, we were gone. He kept calling my grandparents' house to tell her he was sorry, and he would be there soon to make things better. My school's library is open around 2 in the morning for idiots like me who don't do their essays until the last minute. It's a pretty small building, and most of the books are in the basement area called the stacks. Just to give you a quick layout, there's a big main set of stairs that goes down to the stacks, a vending machine room, and long hallway with 4 entrances into the stacks. The stacks are 2 really big rooms on opposite sides of the hallway, with huge amounts of bookshelves and study desks lining the wall. I was there around 11 p.m. last year. It was a pretty research-intensive essay, so I was down in the stacks, working in one of the study desks, so I didn't have to keep going upstairs and downstairs again. I had been there for maybe 2 hours, and everyone except for a boy working on a few desks down from me had already left. I was pretty zoned out by this point. It was an 8 a.m. class, so I didn't have much time until it was due, and I was panicking. So it really ticked me off when I heard someone flipping through book pages really fast to make them do that loud whipping noise on the other end of the room. I sort of ignored it for a while, thinking they'll go away eventually, but they just kept doing it. After about 5 minutes, I got sick of it and started to walk over to them just to tell them to knock it off. I get about 3 steps across the room, and it just stopped. I sat back down and was quiet again for about 10 minutes before the flipping pages noise started again. Only lots louder. like they'd grabbed an enormous book that time. The boy started to get upset too, and he stood up and started walking through the bookshelves trying to find them. It keeps going, so I got up too and started looking around with him. It got really loud, and it was pretty obvious where it was coming from at that point, so we started walking toward it. He was on one side of the shelves, I was on the other. We walked all the way down the shelves. No one was there. We hadn't seen anyone come in the stacks, and we were on the side of the room with the entrances. No way could anyone come in without us seeing them. The noise stopped again, and we both sort of slowly walked back to our seats. I assumed it was just a fan or something in the other room, and I really needed to get my essay done. We sat down, and immediately the noise started again. It sounded like it was coming from right next to the guy's chair. He shoved his stuff in his bag, looked at me and said, "Screw this," and took off. I was out of there maybe 5 seconds after him. I still won't go back in the stacks at night, even when there's other people down there. No essay is worth getting murdered by a weird book ghost. My grandfather revealed this story during the wake for my uncle. My grandfather was an engineer. When he was young, he worked for the big cement company. During his first few months on the job, his company sent him and other fresh recruits up into the mountains to oversee some work, including a couple of seniors to mentor them, a guide for the hike, and the company's caretaker for the hut they'd live in. There were a total of 10 people. My grandfather recalled living in an old wooden hut practicing the Filipino country life. There was no electricity, and they had to light a fire with wood if they wanted to cook. He said it was a really good learning experience for him, not only in regards with his job, but also with living a practical and simple lifestyle. After 2 weeks, their little project was done. Their group decided to take a photo together on the front porch steps of the little hut to have a memento of their time there. Grandfather said they were all lined up, standing in 2 rows in front of the house. 5 people in front, 5 people in the back standing on the porch. Remember, this was the 70s, an era before selfie sticks were invented. They used one of those old film cameras that you have to get developed at a Kodak store. Everyone went back home. At work a few days later, the guy who owned the camera had the photos developed. Everyone crowded around to admire the photos. When they reached the last photo that they had taken as a group, my grandfather did a double take. There were 11 people in the photo, 5 in the front, like they had posed, but 6 in the back. All of them were wearing work t-shirts in the photo, but in the corner of the row of smiling faces stood an unfamiliar face of a middle-aged man wearing formal, outdated clothing that seemed to be from decades ago. He had a grim expression and was looking straight at the camera. My grandfather said that when he and his workmates bumped into the caretaker and hiking guide again, they asked him if they knew who the man in the photo was. Both were surprised and said no. Nobody knew who the man was. My grandfather still has a copy of that photograph tucked somewhere in his house. As I mentioned, my grandfather relayed his story during the wake of my uncle's and my grandpa's sister's son. What prompted the discussion of ghost stories from my otherwise rational grandfather was the experience of his secretary just a few hours earlier. My grandparents have a couple of small businesses, and they have an office and a room in their house for their secretaries. This was at the front of the house. If the secretary had to use the bathroom, they had to go to the kitchen, which was at the back of the house, to use the staff bathroom. My grandparents' house is situated in a big compound with the rest of our relatives. Basically, our neighbors are our family. To the left of our house is my grandpa's older brother's house. Behind theirs is my grandpa's younger brother's house, and behind our own house is my grandpa's sister's house. Confusing, I know, but bear with me. My uncle lived at my grandpa's sister's house. Since their house is behind my grandparents', his room happened to be directly behind the staff bathroom, literally back to back with only a couple of feet between one house and the other. My uncle passed away in his room in the early hours of the morning from a long-term illness. You know where this is headed, right? It was a couple of hours since my uncle's body was transferred to the mortician. Grandpa's secretary went to use the bathroom. She was sitting on the toilet when she heard a very loud thumping sound come from my uncle's room, as if something heavy had fallen on the floor. She just shrugged this off. She heard a man's voice call out, "Help! Help me!" She said the voice was unmistakably my uncle's. She pulled her pants up and hurried out of the bathroom. She figured someone must have seen her using the bathroom and decided to play a prank on her. So later that day, she confronted my uncle's son about it. He denied playing the prank and said nobody was even home during that time. He also told her that right before my uncle died, he had stumbled on the floor and yelled for help. Grandpa had a best friend from ages ago that I think he met while he was still working for that same cement company. This friend was such a big part of our lives that I called him Uncle Eddie. He died a couple of years back, and I hope he's in a better place. Before that, though, he had a pretty traumatizing ordeal that I can only describe as a horror movie level screwed up. Uncle Eddie and my grandpa were the same age. But while my grandpa is a bit of a workaholic, Uncle Eddie wanted to retire. Since Uncle Eddie lived in a tiny countryside town, he and my granddad decided to make their own little farm and a lot down a hill a few kilometers near my uncle's house. Like, legit, you could drive to the farm from his house in 10 minutes. We would often go there every other weekend, and we'd grill some fish, roast some chicken, pluck some coconuts for a Sunday picnic. Nothing big. Just a little yet spacious wooden cottage with a bed, bathroom, and porch. The cottage was surrounded by the farm. Tons of fruits and vegetables Uncle Eddie and his family had grown, though majority of the trees were already there when the land was purchased. There was a modest handmade stall in the corner that housed some chickens and occasionally a pig or goat. Mostly just a ton of trees, mango, coconut, water apple, and other food-bearing plants. There was so much vegetation that you could almost not see the cottage if you were standing from the car parked on the road. Some nights, Uncle Eddie or one of his sons would sleep at the cottage, either to watch over the farm or just relax. They say nearly every dawn at approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, or at least according to the clock above the bed. If you were there alone, you could hear someone knocking on the door even though no one was there when you opened it. You could sometimes hear gigantic bat wings flapping right outside the window, and other times, you could hear someone calling your name. But mostly, it was only Uncle Eddie who experienced the last one. I'm pretty sure he also claimed to have talked to a dwarf. Apparently, Uncle Eddie had already come across some eerie stuff before, but none as sinister as this particular night. Uncle Eddie decided to sleep at the farm again, probably after being tired from farm work. The clock struck 3, and the knocking began. Since he was used to this, he ignored it. Then he started to hear someone call his name. He told us it was the voice of a young woman, and at first it seemed to be from somewhere in the garden, calling for him to open the door and come out of the cottage. As time went on, the voice became louder. It seemed to come from right outside the door. Uncle Eddie was too afraid to open the door, but that the young woman sounded enticing. She told him she was a princess from another world, and that she lived in one of the big mango trees in the garden. She wanted Uncle Eddie to go back to the other world with her and become a prince. All he had to do was open the door. Uncle Eddie told the voice he didn't want to do that. He firmly told it to go away and leave him alone. After this, objects in the cottage began to move, which freaked Uncle out even more. The mysterious voice still kept asking him to open the door and come with her. He waited until daybreak to leave because there was no way he was going to open that door. But by then the voice had stopped. He was so shaken by the experience that he frantically called my grandfather and stepdad as soon as he left the farm. The next day, my grandfather found a local medicine man and invited him to the farm. Grandpa, uncle, uncle's son, Grandpa's house driver, and my stepdad ate dinner with the medicine man. They didn't say anything about my uncle's experience. Without prompting, the medicine man told them that there were many creatures not like us residing in the trees surrounding the farm. There were little dwarves living nearby who were capable of making inanimate objects move. And he suspected there was a creature called a swang, or a whack-whack, with big wings from the mountains as well. But the most striking thing he said to them was that there was a non-human entity calling itself a princess, who would convince human beings to go with it so it could keep them trapped in another dimension. And she lived in a mango tree. My uncle had moved to New Zealand and was visiting family for the holidays. My grandparents' house was getting renovated at the time, whereas my mom's apartment didn't have a place for him. So my uncle stayed at my grandmother's hotel, right beside my mom's apartment. It was my uncle's second night at the hotel. He was staying at a room close to the reception desk. It was just after dinner, and he was relaxing on the bed watching TV when suddenly the channel changed. Changed again, and again, and again. He saw the remote was untouched on the coffee table beside the bed. The TV screen turned to static. Scared, my uncle grabbed the blanket and pulled it over his head. That's when he felt someone forcefully yanking the blanket from his body. The blanket fell to the floor. There was no one else in the room. My uncle ran outside and yelled for help. The hotel staff came and asked what was wrong. When he told them what had happened, they laughed, said that this was normal. Apparently, there was a woman's ghost haunting the hotel, and everyone had either seen it or experienced something creepy. They asked, "Do you know what she looked like?" Long black hair, plain white nightgown. The hotel's employee bathroom was a row of toilet and shower stalls with individual doors, which didn't go all the way up so you could see people if they were standing on the other side. One of the hotel employees recounted he was using one of the stalls when he heard someone come in. He was on the toilet doing his business when he happened to look up, and the ghost lady was peeking from the door, looking right at him. In the Philippines, it's typical for a household to have live-in help or housemaids. My grandparents have a huge 2-story, 4-bedroom house, and during this time, they employed 3 female housemaids and 1 male house driver. One evening, they were having dinner in the maids' quarters, which is a separate area from the main kitchen where you could clearly see out into the backyard, where there was an altar for a crucifix, when one of the maids said, "Who is that out there? Is that madam lighting candles at the altar?" The driver froze and said, "That's not madam." Middle of the evening, pale, almost glowing skin, white dress, long black hair, then seemingly disappeared. They all attest they saw a lady ghost walking in the backyard. The maids once told me they could hear disembodied voices in my grandparents' big house. Like sometimes they would hear someone talking in the dining room and go there only to see it was empty. A couple of times they would hear my grandma yell their names from the office or master bedroom. When they went to see my grandma and asked what she needed, my grandma would be confused and say she didn't call for them in the first place. My childhood nanny, who was one of our maids, ended up marrying the house driver and getting pregnant. At the time, though, they kept this a secret from my grandparents, so they were still sleeping in different rooms. A room for male help and a different room for female help. Let's call our 3 female maids Anne, Jessica, and Norma. Norma had her day off and went to visit her family, so it was only Anne and Jessica in their bunk bed bedroom. At around 1 o'clock in the morning, Jessica woke up to a strange sound outside of their window, which again is situated near our backyard. It sounded like something with long claws or nails was scratching at the windows. "Anne, are you awake? Do you hear that?" "Yes." Along with the scratching, they heard a weird, high-pitched, laugh-like sound that they described at the time as almost inhuman. Somewhat like the sound of a bat, except the volume of the scratching and screeching became so loud that it definitely was made by something much bigger than a bat. Kind of like cackling, the sound of a witch in movies, but not just quite. The sounds were also coming from the window beside the pregnant Anne's bed. It was a typical Friday night, and I was in my bedroom watching TV. I was probably 12 years old at the time. My bedroom was beside the help's quarters, and from one of my windows, I could see the entire maids area. I had been having some trouble sleeping a couple of weeks due to someone that kept calling me, "Psst," from my window. I figured it was just the maids making fun of me, and I'd say, "Cut it out." Sometimes they'd stop. Other times, they seemed to enjoy torturing me and kept doing it for a long time, until it drove me insane. Lately, however, it had stopped. I had completely forgotten about it until it happened again. "Psst!" I heard it again. This time it happened earlier, around 7 p.m. instead of the usual 10 or 12. On the other side of the wall, I could hear the maids were still eating. "Aha! You're not getting away with this. You're not fooling me this time." I said this to myself as I jogged from my room to their dining area to catch the culprit red-handed. A minute later, when I got there, they were talking to each other and clearing the table. "All right, which one of you did it?" I asked in an angry tone, and they looked at me like, "What?" "Did what?" Jessica asked. "Don't lie to me. I know one of you keeps psst me in the middle of the night, and it's really annoying." They became quiet and looked at each other. I could see the genuine confusion on their faces. They also had an uncomfortable yet familiar expression, as though they knew what I was talking about, but were surprised I mentioned it. Anne looked at me dead serious. "We aren't the ones doing that to you, and no one did it just now either." My mom and her boyfriend broke up, and she eventually got together with my stepdad, who was very sensitive to the paranormal. While they were pregnant with their first child, my mom left the apartment and moved away to my stepdad's city. They lived in my stepdad's grandmother's house that my stepdad inherited along with his siblings. The house was old and dim. My stepdad said that when he was single, his sister and her family moved to another house while his brother was rarely home because his work often took him to other cities. One early morning, he was eating breakfast in the kitchen when, from his peripheral vision, he saw someone standing in the corner of the room. He ignored it until he saw the figure move and felt a presence walk directly behind him. The hairs on his neck stood on end, and he turned around to see that there was nobody else in the room except for him. His siblings also claimed to have similar experiences and sightings of a ghostly figure. When my mom got pregnant and moved in with him, the sightings became more frequent. Again, it was an apparition of a woman with long hair and a white dress. Whether it's the same one that he saw, the maids, the hotel staff, or whether it's a different one, I don't know. But my stepdad says that many times he would see the woman outside in the garden, slowly walking in front of their bedroom window. Then it escalated. He was talking to my mom when he looked up and saw the woman standing right in front of their window, staring at my heavily pregnant mother. He told his sister, who went to a local medicine man, to ask for help. The medicine man gave them the tail of a stingray and told them to hang it on their bedroom for protection. My stepdad said it apparently helped. He could still see the woman sometimes, but not as often as before, and never as close as their window. After my mom gave birth, she and my stepdad decided to move in with my grandparents to save money. And also so my stepdad, who was an engineering graduate, could work for my grandpa. During this time, I was already attending university in a different city. A few months after my parents moved back, I visited them. Out of the blue, my stepdad casually says to me, "Hey, when you were still using your old bedroom before, did you ever feel anything strange?" "Why?" I asked him. "When I'm walking by it or using the bathroom there, I just feel like there's some strange presence there or something." A few years later, my grandmother hired a feng shui expert to inspect and bless the house. He had these red little cards with Chinese writings on them, and he'd hang them on places he said had negative energy, and those cards would supposedly counteract the negative energy. Without me or my stepdad mentioning anything to the feng shui guy, guess where he places the red card, because he said it was an area of the house that had one of the most negative energies. Yeah, my old bedroom. My parents and even my brother's nanny told me this. When my brother was still a baby, from 1 to 3 years old, he would sometimes begin laughing in his crib and looking at an empty space as if someone was there right in front of him, playing with him. Sometimes it happened during daytime, but it usually was in the middle of the night when he was already in his crib. There's a big public elementary school in the middle of the city. If you were going to our home from church, the park, or any other city location, you'd most likely have to pass by the school. This also occurred when my brother was still very young. Every time we'd pass by the school, he would wave to someone, then say, "Big sister" in Filipino. Same specific road, same specific part of the school. Even during weekends or on summer break when the school would be empty, he would look up at the same certain spot at the school's deserted second-floor classroom window and wave and say, "Big sister." He's 9 now and hasn't done that or the crib thing in a long time. My parents, however, had another baby. He's turning 2 years old next month. They say he's beginning to do the exact same thing. My mother is Native American. She named my sister Chula, which means fox. Most likely because of her namesake, but maybe not. My sister loved everything that had to do with the fox. Last November, my mom was doing dishes at the sink and looking out the window at the woods like she always does. She looks up from the dishes to the edge of the woods, and at that moment a fox steps out of the woods, sits on its hind legs, and stares right at my mom's face, while she stares back through the window. She said it seemed like 5 minutes they stared at each other. Suddenly the fox got up, turned around, and slowly walked into the woods. My mom said her first thought was to call Chula to tell her about the fox. When she did call her, my sister never answered because she had passed away in a head-on collision that day because of a drunk driver. My mom keeps looking for the fox. It has never come back. I stayed in the Copper Queen Hotel in Bisbee, Arizona. It has a number of fairly infamous hauntings. Usually people report seeing women in the 1900s era's dresses, and minors, and a little boy who supposedly drowned in a nearby stream. I was always fascinated with the paranormal growing up, but never really completely believed in ghosts. Even now my belief is to be determined one way or the other. My mother threw herself into the interest head first, but she put a significant amount of trust in the hoaxy TV shows like Ghost Adventures and whatnot. I was moving out to Arizona for college, and before they dropped me at the dorms for my freshman year, my parents wanted to do an Arizona tour. My mother begged for us to stay at the Copper Queen, since it's been the focus of many a ghost hunting show. She downloaded a stupid hunting app too that allowed ghosts to use their electromagnetic energy to choose words in the app and speak to you. Obviously, it was a random word generator. The Copper Queen was gorgeous, really well maintained, and antiquated. My mother immediately took my dad by the arm. Ghost App pulled up and dragged him to the bar lounge area to look for ghosts. I took our bags upstairs and began unpacking. Okay, here's the weirdness. As I unpacked between the two beds, I suddenly felt like little tiny footsteps in the floor coming from the other side of my parents' bed. I stopped and listened. Then I heard the footsteps coming closer and felt them stop directly in front of the gap between the two beds where I stood. My heart was racing like crazy, and I was frozen in place. I finally gathered up the nerve to ask whatever it was, "Are you there?" I was embarrassed the moment it came out of my mouth because it may very well have been a kid out in the hallway. I kid you not, I heard a giggle. Something was giggling right in front of me. Clear as day, sounded so close I thought I could touch the source. Then it stopped, and the little footsteps ran around to the other side of my bed. It giggled and disappeared. I immediately ran out of the room into the hallway to look around and find a kid somewhere. But nothing. My parents were just arriving to the room as well. I asked them if they saw any kids running around by the elevators or stairs. They said no. I barely slept that night. My girlfriend and I stayed in room 14 at the historic Jefferson Hotel in Jefferson, Texas, just for fun. She always wanted to stay in a haunted hotel, so I obliged. Around 2 a.m., I was abruptly awoken by what seemed to be some drunk walking down the hall, scratching the wall and rattling all the doorknobs as they were passed. Even saw the shadow under my door of what I believed to be someone walking past without stopping as our doorknob rattled. Got up, opened the door to have a word with the prankster. However, no one was in the hallway at all. Yet the scratching sound of the wall and rattle of doorknobs on my side continued farther down the hall, away from me after the other. Forced myself back to sleep, and then woke up at around 3 a.m. for an unknown reason. Just felt like someone was in the room, in the dark, standing and watching over me. I just laid there, eyes open, refused to roll over and look. Laid there for what seemed to be an eternity until the feeling went away. Next thing you know, it was dawn. My girlfriend experienced none of it. She slept through the entire thing. Oddest experience of my life so far. The man with the suitcase and the brimmed hat. Before I get to the story of the suitcase, I have to preface it a little bit. Many years ago when I met my ex, her and her family lived in a mobile home. My ex had a younger sister who was a little messed up in and out of psych wards, etc. My ex and her younger sister shared a room in the mobile home. While we were dating and before my son was born, she told me this story about how her younger sister would wake up and talk to the man in the hallway. The man always had a suitcase and wore a brimmed hat. My ex and her family always dismissed this because the younger sister is a bit off. Flash forward a few years. My ex and I have a son together. Her parents move out of the mobile home and into a house, and we're renting the mobile home to my ex. Our son's room was the exact same room my ex and her sister had slept in. One night, after our son had gone to bed and was asleep for a long time, we heard him get out of bed. We figured he would come out of his room and ask to use the potty. Instead, he started talking to someone. He said hi and started talking about his favorite stuffed animals. At that time, it was a ducky. Curious, I called back and asked who he was talking to. He pops his head out of his room and informs me he's talking to the man with a suitcase and is wearing a hat. At the same time, he was around 2.5 and had never heard about his aunt seeing the same guy. I should start off by saying that my brother is not a military man, but he's your basic hetero, never let him see you cry cliche of a military man. He's not afraid of anything, except for the entire country of Japan. This is his story. My brother joined the Marines when he was 18 and was stationed in Japan. He really enjoyed his time there for a while. The girls, specifically. He made friends with some of the Japanese guys his age who worked around the base. On nights where he and his soldier friends had the night off, the local Japanese guys would show them around, bring them to bars, introduce them to girls, etc. One night, after a little drinking and no luck with the girls, the guys invited my brother home to play video games. My brother accepted the invite, and they played video games for a few hours. During this time, he tells my brother the main reason he wanted to get home early was because his little sister had been suffering from night terrors, causing her to wake up screaming, crying, and sometimes vomiting. He was worried about her and wanted to be home in case she had an episode. At this point in the story, I should explain how this guy's house was shaped. It was built in the shape of a horseshoe with a garden in the middle, and his bedroom was at the very edge of one side of the U shape, and his sister's was all the way at the other end. So they are essentially across the garden from each other. If he looks out of his window, he can see into hers and vice versa. So they decide to call it a night, and the Japanese guy walks over to the window and looks across the garden into his sister's window, just to check on her. He lifts the blind and peers out for a fraction of a second before jumping back screaming and looking at my brother like he just saw something horrible. My brother then goes to look and he stops him. Tells him he saw a dark cloud with red eyes hovering over his sister's sleeping body. My brother naturally does not believe him and decides to look for himself. He creeps quietly over to the window, lifts the blind, but this time finds himself eye to eye with what he describes as a dark black puff of smoke with eyes. My brother and this other guy admit that they got under the guy's covers and stayed there until it was light outside, too afraid to lift the blankets and see that the smoky figure had come a little closer, and was now in the room with them, just on the other side of the thin sheets. I don't know what to believe, or if maybe they drank more than what they said, and imagined it all, but I know my brother believes what he saw. He sticks to his story, and when he tells you, and when he tells it, he looks like someone who saw something truly sinister. This occurrence didn't happen to me, but to my grandmother. It would have taken place in the 1930s. My grandmother was a young teen at the time, and she lived with her mother and 5 siblings in an old house in the middle of the woods. The area was the Ozark Mountains in southern Missouri. My grandmother had gotten into a fight with her mother. She took off into the woods all day to get away from her for a while. When it got dark, she decided to go home. When she got home, the doors were locked and everyone was in bed. There was an old cot sitting outside the house, and she decided to just sleep on the cot until morning. In the morning, when she woke up, there was some creature sitting at the end of the cot. It has been 15 years since I've heard this story, and she only told me once, so my memory is a little fuzzy. I remember she said it was really ugly and had a full set of sharp teeth. It was shaped like a person, but didn't look like a person. She said it just sat there and smiled at her with an abnormally large mouth of sharp teeth. When she started to get up from the cot to get away, it would start to get up and move toward her. When she would sit back down, it would sit back down. She sat there staring at it for a few seconds, and it continued to smile at her. The creature was sitting between her and the front door. She finally jumped up and made a run for the back door. And when she got to the back door, it was locked, but her mother was in the kitchen making biscuits. She banged on the door, screaming to be let in. Her mother told her to go around to the front door because her hands were covered in dough. My grandmother screamed she couldn't and was frantic enough that her mother ran to let her in. She had my grandmother's 2 brothers take the cot out into the woods, chop it up, and burn it. When I was 6 years old, we lived in the center of the set of 3 very similar houses. Ours was purple. The one to the left was blue. The one to the right was yellow. I recently had bought one of those big inflatable bouncy balls from Walmart and had no one to play with me, so I played in the backyard by myself. After school one day, I accidentally hit the ball to the yellow house side of the fence. I was going to ask my mom what to do, but a kid on the other side hit it back for me. Thinking we could play, I hit it back over and he returned it. It became a daily thing, and I would just hit the ball back and forth with him until I got bored after school. The kid wouldn't respond to any questions, so I assumed he was just shy. At one point I hit it over, and he didn't return it, so I asked my mom if I could climb over the fence and go get it. She was never outside with me, so she always thought I was playing alone, I guess. We only got the house because my mom was friends with the landlord, and the houses were recently built. She told me that no one had ever lived there. They were still trying to sell it. We moved not long after, but I still have no idea who was returning that ball to me. I hope you guys liked these stories. I did about half of the rest of the 31. I'll do the rest tomorrow. If you have any kind of live stream request, day, time, genre, topic, please leave a comment in the comment section on any video about that. And if you like this video, please hit that like button and consider subscribing. Thanks for watching. See you next time.